Welcome in. It is Big Ten Today. Great to have you with us on this Thursday. Dave Revson, Nicole Auerbach, a brief pit stop for the two of us in Chicago before we head down to Houston for what should be a fabulous title game.
We see each other in California. We'll see each other in Houston tomorrow. But yeah, I'm still buzzing about the Rose Bowl.
It was incredible, right?
It was remarkable.
It was a great game, and the setting absolutely cannot be beat. The Michigan Wolverines obviously are our big story. Michigan one win away from its first national championship since 1997, its first outright title since 1948. This after pulling out the 27-20 OT win over Bama Monday in the Rose Bowl. Michigan's 14th win of the year. That's a new school record. Ended a 6-game losing streak in bowl games. Just the second bowl victory for Jim Harbaugh. It is the first time that you and I have been on since that game. Biggest takeaways on what we saw in Pasadena?
Well, we saw Michigan get over the hump. This is something that they have been struggling to do. We've watched it in the semifinals each of the last 2 years, and they did it by beating Alabama. They're the gold standard in this sport, the dynasty, Nick Saban, the greatest coach of all time in this sport, and they do it by beating Alabama the way we've seen Alabama beat so many times, so many teams, so many times. Physical at the point of attack. It was so fitting, I thought, that the game ended the way that it did with a stop on 4th and 3rd, and you were able to have the defense start the celebration, because that was the story to me. Obviously, we're going to talk about J.J. McCarthy and Blake Corum and those plays down the stretch, but that defense, the sacks, the pressure, that's what won them the game.
I would use the word cathartic to describe what we saw happen. And you and I were just a couple feet away from one another. There were a lot of Michigan alums, some really prominent ones, Heisman Trophy winners.
And a very sweaty one who's our colleague.
A very sweaty one who's our colleague, Jake Butt, yes. And it was amazing to watch kind of the tenor change in the time that we were down on the field. I mean, just like a little inside baseball, the way that it works is in a game like this, the media, most of the media, other than photographers, aren't really allowed on the field during the game. You can go before the game, and then you can go down with about 5 minutes left to go. And as we were making our way down, Michigan was losing.
Yes.
And so kind of the way that things flipped in that time that we were down there, and the way that you just felt the emotion swing, and when we were down, the Michigan section was behind us. It really was. Again, cathartic is the word I would use.
It's a really great point, because I think after the fumble and then not scoring, it felt like that was it. And then you get down on the field and you watch that drive and the throws and the run from J.J. McCarthy to tie the game up. I think they felt great. I felt it, that they felt good about overtime. And certainly to go and score in two plays, and Blake Corum, it felt like all of the pressure. Alabama was on their heels, and I think that's a really important way to say it, because there were ebbs and flows in that game where you could have counted Michigan out. They made a lot of mistakes on special teams. I was about 20 yards away from the muff punt that almost ended the game on a safety. And then to respond and respond and respond and ultimately win that game, it was so emotional. And I think that goes to the cathartic release that we saw from alums and players. But Jim Harbaugh, all the players, everyone was so emotional, and an outpouring of everything that they have been holding all season in the last 3 years on the field.
And I also think, like, it was evident, I felt like most of the game, the Michigan's the better team.
Yes.
Like, I think Michigan's the better team than Alabama this year. And I think the shame of it is, I think they were the better team than TCU last year, too. And they just didn't play well in that game. And that's not to take anything away from TCU, who richly deserved to win the game. But it was a game where if you just lined the personnel up, Michigan was better. And I think you'd say the same thing about this game. And it felt like, man, if they let a second one slip away, where they are clearly the better team because of some of the mistakes. Although I will say, there are a lot of things they did really well in the game, too. The special teams were the obvious glaring issue, but only turned it over once, only allowed one tackle for loss. I mean, they completely dominated the line of scrimmage against the Tide. They only had a couple penalties in the game. So a lot of the things that they've done all year of not turning it over, being the more physical team, all of that stuff they did. And I think that would have made it all that much more painful if they didn't figure out a way to win the game.
For sure. And I think that what you're talking about how dominant they were and what they were able to do at the line of scrimmage, I think it was really important that it was actually Alabama that they drew. We talked a lot about the potential matchups and if Florida State had gotten in at number 4. I think drawing an SEC team, an SEC champion, kept this team focused every single second of every day leading up to this, because we talked about what's gone wrong in that long lead up to a national semifinal or a bowl game the last 6 times for Michigan. I think that this was so important for them to do that I think they're going to play a little bit freely moving forward, because this was the level, this was the hump that they couldn't get over.
Right, when you repeatedly get asked the same questions, really from the outset of the season.
Yeah.
Because this was a year where Michigan actually came into the year considered the favorite in the Big Ten, which hasn't been the case, obviously, in the 2 previous years. So can you win the Big Ten? Can you beat Ohio State? All that stuff. Those are subplots, and those were going to be a big part of the narrative. But the real narrative with Michigan is, can you get back to the playoff, and can you win where you haven't won in past years? Now, what we could have never foreseen in the preseason, right, when you're looking at a team that was number 2 in the preseason poll. So in some ways, this is where you would expect the number 2 team in the country to end up in the national championship game. What we could have never foreseen was all of the drama that came along with this season, including 2 separate suspensions, totaling 6 games for Jim Harbaugh. And I almost think it's so inextricably linked that you can't separate it out, right? I mean, that is the narrative of Michigan's season. Part of it is all those other things we talked about, but part of it is everything else that was hanging over this team. And I think that was part of the catharsis there on Monday night.
It was, and you heard the players talking about that people didn't want them to be there, that people felt like they didn't deserve to be there, or that they had some unfair advantage. And they were saying, like, no, we lined up and we just beat Alabama. And I think that was really important because, again, all of their biggest games were in the back half of the season after the scandal broke. They won 3 monster regular season games without Jim Harbaugh on the sidelines. It was incredible that the players remained so focused and not distracted at all throughout the season. And I feel like it made them more cohesive and more, again, we saw the Michigan versus everybody,
right,
but it was a cohesion and a closeness that is really remarkable. And I do think that fueled them in a way, right? And you could say, okay, some of this is self-inflicted, or all of it was, right, if you're being accused of rules violations. But it's something that drove them and clearly got them to this point, and they're able to say, hey, we lined up, if there was any advantages, there weren't, and we were able to go out physical and go out and beat Alabama in the semifinal.
And I think that's part of the challenge here in a situation like this, and we'll kind of see how this ends up playing out in terms of NCAA investigation and all of that stuff. But clearly none of the players, like whatever is found out, none of the players are orchestrating any of this or the brains behind it. And so for them, it's almost an uncomfortable situation to be put in, because people are casting a little bit of doubt on your accomplishment. And I think, again, like when you talk about the reaction they had, part of it is the frustration of previous years, but I think a lot of it was the frustration of this year, of knowing they had a really, really good team, and that people are wondering about them kind of all the way along. And certainly you're not wondering about it in this game against Alabama. I mean, you know that toe-to-toe, after everything that's come out, there's not going to be any advantages here, and they just went out and beat them.
Well, and that's, I think, what J.J. McCarthy was saying on a teleconference yesterday. He was talking about the fact that they worked so hard, and they pour all of this time and energy into watching film and trying to find tendencies, looking for little advantages, but just all the hard work and how they feel that a lot of that gets overlooked because of all of the off-the-field headlines, that they're not getting enough credit for the stuff that they're actually doing and that got them to this point and developed them as a team to be in a position to play for a national championship. So clearly that is something that is frustrating, or again, fuels the players internally.
I want to get a little bit into this matchup, and we're going to break it down more later in the show here and kind of get into some X's and O's. But first blush, Michigan, Washington, I mean, 2 undefeated teams. You really couldn't ask for much more than this. You obviously have the fascinating sidebar of the fact that Washington is representing the Pac-12 in the final year of the conference, that they will be playing in the Big Ten next year, that they play a regular season game against Michigan next season. I mean, it's fascinating to think about all that, a regular season conference game, because they played a regular season non-conference game a couple of years ago. What stands out to you kind of big picture about this matchup?
Well, just to underscore that point, the Big Ten is going to have the defending national champion when
no matter
the
what.
season starts in the fall, which is just very important, I think, heading into this era of these super conferences. But I think this is an incredible matchup because we will have an unbeaten national champion in a year that the top of the sport was deeper than usual. And you have the best offense in the country, the best defense in the country. You have a head coach in Jim Harbaugh, who's been one of the best in football at different levels for a long time, hasn't won a national championship, trying to do it with his alma mater, get them over a hump. They haven't played for a national championship since national championship games existed.
Right.
So it's been a while for the winningest program in the sport's history. And then for Washington, Kalen DeBoer, he's familiar to Big Ten audiences. Michael Penix Jr., familiar. I don't think anyone saw that coming. When he gets hired or when they take Michael Penix Jr. out of the portal, no one's saying, oh, pencil them in for a national championship game. So the idea of getting to celebrate the way that those guys win and the way that they develop as players, as a team, is also really cool and different. As you mentioned, a Pac-12 representative, the last year of the league as we know it, they hadn't been in the playoff at all since 2016. So there's a lot of newness, which I think is really fun about this.
I would agree with you, and I think Washington's an amazing story, right? I mean, the year before Kalen DeBoer got there, they were 4-8. And then you think about Michigan in 2020. I know it was a weird season with the COVID year, but they were 2-4, right? So you think about these 3 straight playoff appearances. They come on the heels of 2-4. Washington goes from 4-8, and then the first 2 years of Kalen DeBoer just have been fabulous, including 21 straight wins coming into this game. I also think there's some similarities. I mean, look, Jim Harbaugh was a guy who finished top 3 in the Heisman. He was a well-known NFL quarterback. But people forget his first coaching job, University of San Diego, right? Like, he cut his teeth at a smaller program. And Kalen DeBoer's an amazing story and played at the University of Sioux Falls in South Dakota and then was the coach there and won 3 national championships. That's an NAIA school. So there are some similarities, even though obviously Jim Harbaugh was a household name, and I think Kalen DeBoer could knock on the door of many households and people still would know who he was. But that part of it is interesting to me as well.
And Kalen DeBoer's record as a head coach, right? You talk about the NAIA roots, but to be 104-11 as a head coach at all levels.
Is that good?
It seems pretty good. But the idea that winning translates, like we talk about this in coaching carousels and cycles, and like Chris Kleiman at Kansas State as well, and Lance Leipold, like these are coaches who can win at lower levels. It doesn't mean that they're not able to translate that at the highest level. So I think that's really cool. And again, as with the Jim Harbaugh piece too, look for coaches like that. Look for coaches who are cutting their teeth at those levels and figuring out ways to win when you don't have the most talented players that exist in college football. I think that's really cool. And that's one of the parts that is so fun about this Washington team is they're going to have a lot of pros. But again, I don't know how many of those guys we would have penciled in 3 years ago and said, oh, yeah, that's a surefire NFL player.
Right. No, it's fascinating that, in this era of recruiting rankings, we're not looking at 2 teams. We're looking at 2 teams that recruit well, but we're not looking at the 2 best recruiters in terms of where they are in the rankings year in and year out. And yet here they are playing for the national championship. And look, the portal has a lot to do with that. Certainly in Washington's case, you get a quarterback of Michael Penix's ability. He was recruited, as we know, originally he was going to Tennessee and then Indiana and ends up at Washington in the portal. But I do think, like, this was a year, to your point, where we kind of came into those last couple weeks of the season and there were 8 to 10 teams where you thought, hey, legitimately, they could win it. Alabama came from number 8 into the playoff in the final week. And so maybe this is emblematic of what we saw during the course of the year.
It was a really fitting bookend, I think, for the last year of the 4-team playoff, because if we had something like this every year, I don't think this would have expanded. But you had so many teams that deserved a chance to play for a national title on the field. You had 5 really strong conference champions in the mix. We haven't had the Pac-12 engaged like this in recent years. So you had all of these different stories all across the country engaged and part of the national championship hunt. And I think that was really, really cool. And so it's awesome that you have a team, well, I guess technically 2 teams from the North, right? Like a Pacific Northwest team and a team from the Midwest, but teams that have not played for a national championship or won one, again, because pre-BCS it was shared titles and you got anointed. But that's really cool because I think regional balance is something that we don't talk about enough in college football. And I think it's really important to have that and not have every single champion coming from the same couple of teams in the Southeast.
Absolutely. Washington hasn't won it since 1991, shared national championship. Michigan hasn't won it since 1997, as we mentioned earlier, also a shared national championship. One of those teams will be the outright national champ on Monday night. A couple hoops games in the conference last night, as seen on the Big Ten Network. Ohio State built a 17-point lead in the first half, held off a Rutgers rally, won it by 4. Meanwhile, Nebraska got 28 from Keisei Tominaga. They beat Indiana for the first time in nearly 5 years, a 16-point home victory. As promised, Katsy is here to talk through these games. Let's start with Nebraska. Really a fabulous performance. Keisei Tominaga was unbelievable. I think one of the cool things about Nebraska in this 12-2 start, which is their best ever as a Big Ten team, is that they have been really good this year. And Keisei Tominaga has been good, not great. If he plays anywhere near like he played last night, holy cow, are they going to be good?
Well, there are a couple factors. First, you have the family in town, in Japan. The crowd loves him. He's finally healthy. That's the main thing, is that he's finally healthy. And, if you remember, he came off of the FIBA tournament down in the Philippines where he got Japan into the Olympics next year. And it took a little while to get going.
Right.
Good two-point shooter, known as a three-point shooter, but his two-point game has really improved. And you're right, if he plays like that, the balance they got from Lawrence, from Mast, who was back, healthy, Gary, Bryce Williams, Wiltshire, everyone contributing. Offensively, they are a tournament team.
Oh, I think so, too. I think they're a tournament team defensively, too. I mean, to me, Fred made a choice, I thought, going into last year that they had to be tougher. And he went out, he got Juwan Gary and Emmanuel Bandamil in the portal. And if you remember at the beginning of last year, right, they took Purdue down to the wire. You think about what would have happened had they won that game. But then Gary and Bandamil, to your point, got hurt. They had to change the way they played, and they actually played really well down the stretch last season as well. But I think I know from talking to him, he made a concerted decision that, hey, if we're going to win in this league, we're going to have to play a little bit slower tempo than I think he wanted to play initially. And we're going to have a team full of tough guys. And that, to me, is the fascinating transition that they've made. I mean, they were great defensively. They forced 19 turnovers yesterday. They had 15 steals. So this isn't just a team made up of three-point shooters, although they have some really good ones. This is a team that excels on both ends of the court.
And Fred talked about this after the game. I think that K-State game, that's the season changer for them. To go on the road at Bramlage, one of the hardest places to play, not just in the Big 12, but in the country. Villanova lost there earlier this season. Kansas has lost there before. Regardless who's the coach, whether it's Bruce or Frank Martin or Jerome Tang, it's a tough place to play. And they held them to under 50 points. That was significant because prior to that, non-conference wise, they just did, it was a schedule meant for who they were at the time.
Right.
That was the signature game. They beat Michigan State. Now, they lost to Minnesota, but I think Minnesota, we'll talk about them, I think they're better than people think they are. And I don't think that loss on the road will look as bad 2 months from now. And so they recovered from that. And the Michigan State win at home, the K-State win, beating Indiana, which even though I think they're better than Indiana right now, that have been a bit of an albatross for them recently because they've lost 7 straight. So this is a significant shift and change for the Huskers going forward.
We're going to get a really good sense of them coming up here in the next 2 games. They go to Wisconsin this weekend, and then they're home against Purdue. So we'll get a good gauge. But to me, I really feel like this is a tourney team. And again, like Bryce Williams only played 5 minutes. He's their leading scorer, only played 5 minutes in the first half yesterday. You had Mast, as you mentioned, coming back from a minor knee procedure. He was certainly not at his best. He was nowhere near as good as he was, say, in that game against Kansas State. So I think what's exciting is I think they're just scratching the surface of how good they can be when everyone's together and healthy. Before we move on to the other game, let's talk about the Hoosiers. What do you make of Indiana's performance? Mike Woodson was really unhappy afterward, unhappy with the way that his team failed to protect the basketball. We talked about the turnovers, and then he really went off on the guard play on the post-game radio show. The term he used to describe it was awful. They had Xavier Johnson back. Look, it's hard to argue with it. They had Xavier Johnson back. He came back from the injury. You understand there's going to be some rust, but did not score, had 4 turnovers. It just, we talk about Nebraska looking like a tournament team. Indiana did not last night.
No, they're going to be in a perilous situation. They had 19 turnovers, as you mentioned. Xavier Johnson, we have to give him time to get back.
100%.
4 turnovers, 3 assists. Trey Galloway, it's interesting with him. I think that when he's on, he's an exciting player. He makes things happen. He's very active. He can make big shots. But the question I have with Trey Galloway, is he a 1? And I don't mean a point guard. I mean, is he a 1 guy? Is he an alpha? Or is he better served as a second, third supportive player? And in Xavier Johnson's absence, he's had to be the guy on the perimeter. And I don't know if he is that. And that's okay. Maybe he is a supportive guy, but needs to be more consistent at that level. Inside, they have the talent. I mean, Ware, Mbako, Renew, all of them.
Yes.
I mean, that's a better front court than Nebraska has. It's one of the better in the Big Ten. They got in foul trouble. No one fouled out, but it was when the fouls came. Got a little chippy. They got frustrated, and then it steamrolled. Certainly in a great road environment. It's interesting with them, and this is, we talk about all the time about those December games in the Big Ten and how they matter. Like, think about if they didn't start 2-0. They'd be in real trouble right now.
Yeah.
They've got those 2 on the shelf, the road win at Michigan, the home win over Maryland. Now they lose at Nebraska. But at least they've got 2. Other teams that didn't do well in December, you're climbing out of that hole in January. They still have a lot of problems, but they've at least got 2 in the bank as we go forward.
And they have no bad losses at this point. I mean, losing.
Played a really hard schedule.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right? And played Kansas. I mean, you think about, man, they were right there with Kansas. They led for the overwhelming majority of the game. If you could figure out a way to have won that game, that's a huge feather in your cap.
UConn and New York.
Yeah, and Auburn.
That's almost impossible.
Right.
Auburn's a top 20 team.
Yeah.
Kansas at home.
Yeah.
I mean, their strength of schedule is great.
Yes. Yeah, they'll just have to figure out a way to win some games. They have an opportunity this weekend. Ohio State coming to town. Ohio State's
a nice segue.
Yes, Ohio State is a very good team. They beat Rutgers last night at home. They built a big lead. As I mentioned, they were up by 17 in the first half. They let Rutgers get back into it, although I think a lot of credit for that goes to Rutgers. But, man, in that first half, I think we saw what makes Ohio State so dangerous. And Rafael and I were talking about this on the pregame show yesterday, and mentioned it with Stephen Bardo, too, as he did his pregame interview with us. Jamison Battle is really their third scoring option, and he can change a game. And that is the difference for them this year. I mean, we know how good Thornton and Roddy Gale are going to be in that backcourt, but Jamison Battle adds that extra dimension. And when those guys are all on, man, they're tough to stop.
So this is a great example, and I've talked to Ohio State about this. This is nothing against Bryce Sensabaugh, okay, who obviously is an NBA talent. But what they needed, what Thornton and Gale needed, was a veteran guy to shepherd them along in this process from freshman to sophomore year. And Sensabaugh was not that guy. I mean, he was a peer. And Battle comes in. This is the first time in Battle's career, whether it's GW, Minnesota, that he's played with this much talent. Right. And that he hasn't had to be the alpha guy. And I think he's flourishing in this role. It's taken a little bit of time for him to find himself as the leader. But what Ohio State has told me is he has helped them out tremendously on and off the court and balancing all of that. And so that Gale and Thornton can fill their roles, can fill the stat sheet, but not feel like they have to be everything as young players. Battle is handling a lot of that. And they also did a great job of not stressing and pressing when they lost the lead. Think about the Penn State game. Lose an 18-point lead.
Yeah.
On the road to Penn State. Last year, that would have really sent them reeling. This year, they talked about it after that game. They settled down. They had a close win against West Virginia and Cleveland. They had the win against UCLA that was a little close in Atlanta. So they're finding out how to finish games, which they didn't do a year ago. It wasn't like they were getting blown out all the time. They were young, inexperienced, and this was a great example in this Rutgers game because they blew the lead. But they didn't blow all of it, but they blew it where Rutgers was right there.
Yeah, it was down to 1.
And they didn't panic.
Let's talk a little bit about Rutgers because they were coming off, I mean, let's just be honest, a really bad performance over the weekend against a Stonehill team that was 2-12, that was down a number of its best players. I mean, that's just a game it shouldn't be close. and they needed a really big
Is
shot.
that the first time we've talked about Stonehill on BTN? Kind of like Lafayette.
I think this might be Stonehill.
Rutgers brings that out of us.
Unfortunately. I think this might be the first Stonehill reference. Okay, so you're coming off that performance where you couldn't throw it in the ocean from the beach. I mean, offensively, you just looked really challenged. And I thought, particularly in the second half, I thought their offense really came alive in this game. Derek Simpson was phenomenal. He had been struggling. I mean, he hit that three against Stonehill. He was one of his last 13 from three, and that was the one. I mean,
right.
He won the Good Timing Award. But still, they need him to get going. I still feel like if you're coming out of this, Steve Pikiell, I think you feel pretty good about what happened last night.
You do. And for those that are curious, it's in southern Massachusetts, by the way, Stonehill College.
Yeah.
Just rising up to D1. Look, I saw Ray Feld talk about this, and we've talked about this. Derek Simpson, I think we thought that by this point he would have taken that next step. It's taken more time than I think anyone could have imagined. But look, he's here now. 23 points. Now he's going to be consistent with it. Fernandez, the transfer from UMass, he had 17. But it was the bench. The bench, they got essentially 5 points off the bench. Gavin Griffiths, a freshman, he's got to try to produce more. They've got to get more off their bench. They were 6 of 24 on threes, so that's still an issue for them. But the fact that they were able to score in the 70s against Ohio State, where they only got in the 50s against Stonehill, that is progress. They've dug themselves such a deep hole right now that it's more of a matter of how they're going to play in these last 2 months. Whatever happens, happens. Get that momentum going, because really the core of this team should be back. I'm not mailing this in for the rest of the season. The bus is not, parked somewhere where it can't get out of a ditch. But they still obviously have a lot of positive things going forward with that top 2 recruiting class coming next year. And so they got to just keep building this momentum.
This is a big game, I think, coming up this weekend against Iowa, because both those teams have to look at
Winnable.
this one and say, this is a game we kind of need to get. Iowa's dug themselves a bit of a hole as well. But I'm with you. I still think, look, there's a ton of momentum in the program, obviously, with Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey coming next year. But I still think I come out of that. Maybe it's a glass half full approach. Maybe it's the mutual admiration society that we have for Rutgers. But I still think there's some positives coming out of that game. More from Andy coming up in a bit. Is back with us. We kind of talked big picture earlier in the show. So let's get into the X's and O's here. I actually want to start with the offhand. I want to start with the portion of the game that I think for each team gets less publicity, and that would be Michigan's offense against Washington's defense, because I do think sometimes games are decided by who plays their offhand better. So what do you see in this matchup, and give us a sense of what we should expect from the Huskies defensively?
Well, they're kind of middle of the pack against the run, particularly. But part of the reason that everyone picks against them all the time, and I personally did, I picked Oregon to beat them twice, and then they were the underdog against Texas, is because of the defense, right? I don't think they get enough credit for how physical that they are. But also, again, they are good at forcing turnovers, but their stats are not going to overwhelm you. And I think that's kind of what you look at if you're Michigan and you love to run the ball. It's such an important piece of your identity, even when it's not super explosive, although we did see some explosive plays from Blake Corum in the national semifinal game. You're looking at a defense that gives up 4.4 yards per carry. That's 86th in FBS. So there is going to be opportunity on the ground. And Michigan's got a good offensive line, too. We've talked about what happened with Zach Zinter going down, but this should be an opportunity for them to control the trenches on that side as well, which, again, that's such an important piece for setting up how J.J. McCarthy plays best, which is when he's scrambling, making short, medium passes, and then, they can maybe mix in some trick plays.
Right. I don't think that Michigan's offense necessarily has played great here in the back third of the season, but the best performance in that time was against Alabama, right? And I think there's a lot of things you can build off there. It felt like they got Roman Wilson involved again. Blake Corum, obviously, in the overtime, he was not going to be brought down. I mean, that final touchdown run that happened right in front of us was just unbelievable effort. And they were able to involve JJ in the run game, as you say. And that, to me, we had certainly talked about the fact that he had been banged up. He had admitted that he wasn't at 100%. He is, look, is he Jalen Milroe? No, he's not. But he is a really mobile quarterback who can beat you with designed run plays and can keep a defense off balance. And that's what he was able to do to a certain extent against Alabama.
It felt like they thought that he was going to struggle more, the O-line was going to struggle more, so they were trying to have him scramble a little bit, and they realized, no, we can actually just run the ball. We can we can go up the middle a little bit more. But I think we all thought we'd see more JJ run game, and I think that you still have that in your arsenal. He did say he's healthy. He said he was like 110% healthy heading into the semifinals, so that's really big for them. He's also a really good thrower on the run, which we saw in action as well in the semifinal. But I just always think not falling behind early is important for them because of the balance of the offense and the fact that they do want to run the ball. But I'm really encouraged by the fact that Blake did have a couple long runs. They have explosive runs because we did not see that a lot this season. We talked about it every week.
Yeah. I know this is going to be billed as a contrast in styles offensively. I mean, I think to a certain extent it's true, but I also think there's a little bit of a misconception. I mean, again, Michigan can score with the best of them, as we know. Are they looking to air it out in the way that Washington is? No, they're not. But I would also say, as we mentioned with Dylan Johnson, like Washington can run the ball. They have a really good offensive line. Michael Penix is going to be the headliner. Part of the reason is because of his supreme talent, and part of the reason, Nicole, is just how talented these wide receivers are. I mean, again, like Marvin Harrison Jr. is phenomenal. Rome Odunze had every bit as good a year, and he is every bit as terrifying a wide receiver as Marvin Harrison Jr. is. And then the other guys that they have around him, and Jalen Polk is phenomenal. Jeremy Bernard's a guy who we saw at Michigan State who has emerged. The tight end is exceptional. So this is a passing attack that you absolutely fear. But if Dylan Johnson is healthy, you can't rely solely on trying to shut down the pass.
No, and that's why his emergence in the middle of the season was really important for them because of what it does open up in the pass game. And they had injuries in the receiver room. But when they are at full strength, it is really terrifying. This is going to be both the best quarterback that Michigan's defense has faced, but also the best wide receiver room. This is like the room that we usually see in Ohio State, where you see like 2 or 3 or 4 guys who can all break open a game. But Washington has all of them. And I think the big key, before we get into the individual matchups like at the line of scrimmage, is that Michigan's offense is going to need to stay on the field. They're good at putting together long drives. They lean into the run game. But that is one of the important pieces when you're going up against an offense like this that just has quick strike capability.
It'll be fascinating to see kind of how Michigan tries to match up with them. I mean, you would think that Will Johnson will spend a lot of time covering Rome Odunze. I think that the thing that's really interesting to me is Washington wants to get yards in big chunks. I mean, Michael Penix has a huge arm. He is amazingly accurate on those deep balls. And other than Iowa, no one has given up fewer plays of 20 yards or longer in the country this year than Michigan. And that's kind of where you get into this notion of strength against strength. That's what Washington wants to do. They want to gash you with those long pass plays. It's really hard to do against Michigan.
That's why it's such a fascinating matchup, and I think we're all really excited to see, because we talked about some of the similar things with the Washington-Texas matchup and the idea of this Joe Moore award-winning offensive line for Washington and then terrifying defensive front for Texas, and the Washington offensive line won that battle.
Right.
And it's not just that they limited sacks, but it's also that, like, Michael Penix Jr. is really good when he scrambles as well. So even if you think you're going to get pressure on him or you're in the backfield, he can still make a spectacular play. And that's what Michigan is certainly going to be aware of and be ready for. And I thought that's what they did a really good job with Jalen Milroe. Even once he started moving the ball and they changed protections, they eventually adapted to that and they were able to be in the right spots to tackle him, to tackle different running backs that were getting involved. But that's the biggest part, because you can think you got him wrapped up, but he's very slippery.
Right, they've given up 11 sacks all year, Washington's offensive line. You think about how Michigan won that game against Alabama. To me, the difference was, and they set the tone on that very first possession. Remember, they ended up with 2 sacks on that first possession. They had 5 in the first half. They had 6 for the game. But again, it was the dominance at the line of scrimmage, and this is going to be harder to do. I mean, let's just kind of be honest here. Like, Alabama's offensive line at the beginning of the year was dreadful. It had gotten better as the year went on, but I mean, in the Rose Bowl, like, they could barely snap the ball. I mean,
over and over again. It wasn't just one off. Yeah.
And yet they were right there with Michigan, and the game went to overtime. Again, a lot of that is their defense is better than Washington's, and Michigan, the special teams gaffes, I think, kind of kept Alabama within striking distance. But this is a much different animal, what they're up against here offensively for Washington, and this is going to be the biggest challenge, no doubt, that Michigan has faced all year.
This has been the most fun offense to watch in the country all season
Right.
long. I mean, it looks like a video game, and the way that Michael Penix Jr. throws the ball, it's a thing of beauty. Yeah, he's got a long windup, whatever. I love it. He's a lefty. I hope an NFL team drafts him higher than he's being projected at. But this team is so fun because there's so much talent on that offense, and they can do a lot of different things. Ryan Grubb, their offensive coordinator, super creative play caller, and we saw that in the Sugar Bowl, right? You had two of the best play callers in the game just in their bag of tricks, and I think you're going to see that too. But again, maybe Michigan goes to some of those trick plays. We even saw them in the semifinal as well, because I think they're going to have to be trying to keep each other off balance and to not be what they expect. Because again, we see the strength against strength. We see the offhand matchups. They're going to try to figure out the edges.
4,600 passing yards for Penix this year. You talk about Michigan. Sharon Moore had an unbelievable
He did too.
day calling plays, and the one that sticks out to me is the double pass where JJ made the
I don't know how he did that. That was so athletic.
Yeah, it was incredible. And then with the man in his face completes the second part of that trick play. It should be great. Safe travels down there. Look forward to seeing you and working with you in Houston as we cover what might just be a national championship. Tonight in the Big Ten, Michigan State's going to host Penn State. Spartans seem to have turned the corner, looking to make it 5 straight wins. After that, Minnesota and Michigan in Ann Arbor. They're both 1-1 in conference play. Andy's back with me the rest of the show. Let's talk first about Penn State and Michigan State. Now I want to focus on the Spartans. I mean, there was a lot of hand-wringing here early on this year about what was going on with Michigan State. It feels to me like they've turned the corner. I mean, the Baylor game was an absolute thumping. I was really impressed with how they played against Indiana State as well, because I think that's a tournament team. They're really good. That's a terrifying team to have to go up against, and I thought they handled them really nicely. It feels to me like this thing's headed in the right direction. In your opinion, what's changed here?
Yes, it is. And I also think the timing of that game matters. That game was after Christmas, right before New Year's. It is traditionally a danger zone for teams coming out of the break. And you're playing a team that I think is going to win games in the NCAA tournament. They're the best team in the Valley, without question.
Right.
I think they're better than Drake, Southern Illinois. So they're going to win games. You're going to remember Indiana State. That win is going to matter in March. And to bookend it with the Baylor game. In between, you had Oakland, always good, tough with them, and Stony Brook. So that was a great 4-game stretch for them over a break for Michigan State. The key thing, it's all about their big 4. It's what it is. I mean, they all have to play well. It's pretty simple. Tyson Walker, A.J. Hoggard, Jaden Akins, Malik Hall. Those 4. They got to stay healthy. They got to play well. They all scored in double figures in the game against Indiana State. Their bigs are their bigs. They're never going to get much out of the bigs. They're going to have to defend with that foursome. They're going to have to score with that foursome. Can they ride that foursome pretty far? Yes. They're all really good players. They're all experienced. And they're finally playing well. And I think that, I think it's that simple.
To me, the missing part of that was Hoggard.
Yes.
And it really feels like he has, I don't want to use the phrase turn a corner because I already used it once with the whole team, but it just feels like he's kind of got his game back here. He's got his confidence back. And we know it's been a little bit of a roller coaster ride with him through the years, but the talent is undeniable. And it feels like here these last few games, he's kind of figured it out. He's playing within himself. He's taking good shots. He's distributing the ball. And you know that makes Tom Izzo happy because that's such a huge part of his offense is how that point guard's performing.
And go back to the Baylor game because Baylor has really good guard play. The fact that they dominated that game from opening tip to the end in Detroit, back against the wall. It was their last big time, I'm not dismissing Indiana State, but it was their last big time matchup, and they stepped up and they answered it. And I think there's significance in that going forward. Now, they're going to lose games in the Big Ten. They're going to lose probably some games on the road. We'll see if that happens at home. But I think you're right. There's no question. I'll use it. They have turned the corner. They're going to be an NCAA tournament team because it was questionable a couple of weeks ago. Could they get back to that? They're going to be there. They're going to be a very dangerous seed because their record may not be as good as their talent.
Yeah.
I mean, if they end up being like a 7 or something, I'm just making this up, they're going to be a dangerous team if they get by that first round to who's ever that higher seed in round 2.
There's a reason they were a top 5 team coming into the country. There's a lot of talent there, no doubt. Let's talk about Penn State. It feels to me like Penn State's getting a little bit better here. They've won 3 of their last 4. Each of their last 2 losses were in overtime. They were robbed in one of those losses. The game at Madison Square Garden should have been a win, just kind of a phantom call that cost them the game. What have you seen here as Mike Rhodes tries to, and look, it's hard. You're cobbling it together because of how depleted that roster was when he took over.
Well, you mentioned football and the T's, so we'll go there. They've got to take care of the ball, no turnovers. They got to run the ball in terms of running it up. And talking to Mike Rhodes, they can't allow runouts, limit the turnovers, and they got to rebound like they've never rebounded before.
Yeah, that's a problem. They're not a good rebounding team.
But Michigan State, is rebounding more from their big wings and guards than they are from their true bigs. Right. So this is actually not a bad game for them, in that sense. But Rhodes told me, look, we got to play loose. And when they have done that, as they did in that second half against Ohio State, they've done a much better job.
Let's focus a little bit here on Minnesota and Michigan. And, man, Minnesota, you mentioned it earlier. I mean, they are, I think, somewhat quietly playing much better here. 5 straight wins. That includes a win over Nebraska. I mean, we just sat here lavishing praise on Nebraska. Minnesota has beaten Nebraska. And so now they go on the road against a Michigan team that's coming off the loss to McNeese. There's no shame in losing to a Will Wade team. I mean, McNeese is good, but that's not a team you should lose to at home. So where do you see each one of these teams heading into this matchup?
And the other problem with that was Shahada Wells had 30. So you let some guy just go off on you from McNeese. Phil Martelli was telling me, look, we got to limit turnovers. Key thing, like Rhodes was saying, get out in transition. As for Minnesota, Ben Johnson said, the confidence matters. They are feeling confident. That Minnesota game is proof of that. They've got great cohesion. They're attacking. They're being aggressive. And we said this earlier about other teams that suffered a bad loss. The way Minnesota lost to Missouri earlier this season.
Painful.
At home.
Painful.
That, a year ago, kind of like Ohio State losing to Penn State this year, giving up an 18-point lead. A year ago, that loss that Minnesota suffered to Missouri at home, where they had the game, that would have literally basically snowballed for them, and they would have had a bunch of losses. They didn't. They flipped it, and they used it to their advantage. Same thing Ohio State did with the Penn State loss. So that's why this is a different Minnesota team. I don't think anyone is going to have an easy go in the barn at Minnesota. And now Minnesota can go into Michigan. They can win, and they can be a factor down the rest of the season.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting to see kind of the vision that Ben Johnson had. It is coming together. They are a physical team. I mean, nothing is going to come easy, and their guard play is so much better. I mean, Hawkins leading the nation in assists. The freshman Cam Christie's been good. It is a much improved team. Dramatic conclusion of a 10 battle tomorrow night at Mackey. Number 1 Purdue hosting 9th-ranked Illinois. First of 2 meetings between these two this season. They'll play again in March in Champaign. Oilers are 13-1. The Illini are 11-2. Both fresh off convincing wins Tuesday night. Illinois obliterated Northwestern in Champaign. Purdue took down Maryland in College Park. It should be a fabulous game. These are the 2 best teams in the Big Ten, in your opinion. Would you maybe put Wisconsin in that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably get criticized from Illinois fans, but I'm not convinced yet Illinois is the second best team. They played great against Northwestern. They did lose indefinitely a all Big Ten player. So I want to see what happens. I mean, there's no question they can be, but I think right now the Badgers are.
Okay, to me, the most interesting part any time of Purdue taking the court is how will the other team deal with Zach Edey. I actually think Coleman Hawkins, if he's on his game, can make things difficult on Zach Edey because of his ability to pull him out.
Yeah, I mean, Coleman Hawkins finally is healthy. He's playing up to his potential, both sides of the court. On the Purdue side, though, I just think something's different this year in a positive way. The way they beat Maryland on the road, I know it's not the same Maryland team, but it's a better Purdue team. And Purdue handled, every challenge, save those last couple of minutes against Northwestern. That was a significant road win for them. I think they win Friday night at Mackey.
It's tough to go into Mackey and win. It's a huge assignment.
I know, I'm not going way on a limb here.
Yeah, but we're going to learn a lot about both those teams. More thorough preview tomorrow.
We'll be here tomorrow.
Jay Lehman will be here as well. See you then.